So tonight we're going to hear from Clive Smith, who's going to give us a brief history of the inquiry and how we got here. Jessica Bomford will then talk to some of the themes from the inquiry. Then Anne Harrod Hurl from Eversheds, who's experienced in running inquiries, will give her views on the sort of next steps and what they've been doing during the lockdown. And then Clive will come back and talk a little about what our hopes and aspirations and hopefully outcomes for the inquiry will be. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Clive.
Thank you, Deborah, and good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining. For those of you who joined us 2 weeks ago, as Deborah said, this is the second in the series, as it were. We started off 2 weeks ago by talking about the international perspective, as it were, getting an idea of what had happened in both Canada and in Ireland. And so we wanted to give it some background and context before then focusing a little bit more about where we are now in the UK and just going through the background as to how we actually got here, because I think most people will agree it's been somewhat of a long and winding road. So this evening, what we're going to talk about to start with is how do we reach the stage of a public inquiry? And in particular, we're going to look at the 1989 litigation and the support schemes that came out of that. And then we'll just touch upon the Archer inquiry and the Penrose inquiry, and then talk about the political climate which existed in the United Kingdom in 2017, which culminated in the announcement of the public inquiry. To start with then, as many people know already, but for those from outside the community who might not have as much knowledge and background, since 1989, the Haemophilia Society and many other groups in the United Kingdom, I think it's only fair to say, have called for a public inquiry in relation to the contaminated blood scandal in the UK. As we know, these had already happened in many other countries around the world, such as Canada, such as Ireland. Other countries had had their own investigations, America and France, etc. But in the UK, there was this clamour and call for a public inquiry since as long ago as 1989. The big question is then, therefore, why did it take so long? As ever, it's not a simple answer. There's no one simple reason why it didn't happen. So it's necessary just to chart some of the history to give an outline and an understanding of why it took so long, perhaps in the UK, to get to the stage where we managed to have a public inquiry finally set up. Following the infection of around 1,200 haemophiliacs with HIV in the United Kingdom, legal action was obviously taken against the government. And that was the first in relation to the series of legal actions against the government. That happened, obviously the infection happened in the late 70s and early 80s, and that legal action started towards the end of the 1980s. Shortly before this case, all cases were joined together in what we now call a group litigation order. But shortly before the case came to trial, a settlement was reached with government. As ever, there's a lot of negotiations that goes on in terms of legal proceedings, and that's exactly what happened in relation to the proceedings that it was proposed to bring. In relation to that settlement, depending on people's individual circumstances, and by that I mean, for example, it might be that someone, a haemophiliac who was married with children, would, for example, have received more than somebody who was maybe 10 years old at the time of being infected, because of course they had less dependents. But of course, depending on someone's circumstances, people received a differing degree of ex gratia payments. And that point at the end of that slide there in relation to ex gratia payments, I know is incredibly important to our community. The money that's been paid by government has always been on a no-fault liability basis. It's been erroneously referred to many times, usually by politicians, as compensation. It has never been compensation because, of course, if the government were paying compensation, then they would have to admit liability. And that has never happened in the United Kingdom. As well as those payments, in relation to the 1989 litigation, I say the litigation culminated around 1991, but as well as those payments that were made, the government also set up a body called the McFarlane Trust. And that was exactly that. It was a body which was given money, and the money was held on trust for the beneficiaries, for those people who've been infected with hepatitis C. The purpose of the McFarlane Trust was to provide ongoing financial support to those who were in need. And whilst people received, they received annual payments, and I say annual payments in the sense there was a sum of money for a year, and people had a choice as to how they wanted to receive it. You could either receive it as a lump sum for the year, you could receive it quarterly, I think, or you could receive it monthly. So as I say, those yearly payments in terms of the amounts were made to people. But on top of that, people could make other applications for grants from the McFarlane Trust. They would make applications for things like bedding. We've heard, and we'll touch on this a little bit later in relation to the inquiry and themes that have come out, but people had trouble, night sweats, those sorts of things. They would go through bedding quite quickly, white goods, double glazing for their homes, all those sorts of things. All the sorts of things they would normally have been able to buy if they were in work and were able to be employed. But of course, so many of them were denied that as a result of their infections. So they could apply additionally on top of the annual support payments for further financial grants from the McFarlane Trusts. What was incredibly important, rather, and I think probably unique in the world in relation to what happened in relation to HIV and haemophilia and the contaminated blood scandal in the UK, was that a waiver had to be signed. And the waiver had to be signed by all people taking legal action. It was very much a case of all or nothing. Either everybody signs it or nobody gets anything. I think Sir Brian Langstaff, the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, has already referred to this as a form of moral blackmail. But everybody had to sign that or nobody got a thing. As a result of that, of course, there was enormous pressure on the haemophilia community to sign that waiver, and that's exactly what did happen. That waiver meant that people had to agree not to take any further action against government. And secondly, very importantly for the community, was that very late on in the negotiations, hepatitis was added to the waiver. So initially it was a case of not taking any further legal action in relation to HIV infection against government, but hepatitis was added at the very end of it in what many people think was a deliberate ploy by government, because they knew the scale of infection, or they potentially knew the scale and level of infection. But at the time, many patients, many people with haemophilia knew nothing about hepatitis, let alone the fact that they were infected with it. Alongside the McFarlane Trust, there were other schemes set up which paid lump sums to people who were infected with hepatitis C. Most notably, and the best known out of all of them, was probably the Skipton Fund. There are various other funds as well. There was the Eileen Trust and there was the Caxton Foundation. And these were all essentially, again, trusts set up who were given money by government to distribute to beneficiaries. And the fund that applied to you depended on your route of infection. So we've talked about the Skipton Fund, for example, in relation to people with haemophilia. Of course, there are other people infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusions and other routes. So it depended on your route of infection as to which fund applied to you. But as I say, I think the Skipton Fund is probably the best known in the community. That applied to anyone who was infected in pre-September 1991 in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. That cut-off date, that arbitrary cut-off date, has been a particular issue for some people in the community as well, because they feel that they were infected after that date, but it's meant that they've not been able to have recourse to the funds in order to receive lump sum payments. Those payments were available to people who as a result of hepatitis C infection, had chronic infection, and that therefore didn't cover those people who self-cleared. Some people who were infected with hepatitis C actually went on to self-clear without any treatment whatsoever. I still think that I'm not sure the medical community entirely understand why people go on to self-clear, but there we are. That was one of the idiosyncratic aspects of hepatitis C, that some people do self-clear. As a result, I think it's fair to say, as a result of these financial settlements, the government largely felt, and I say government of all hues, felt that the issue had largely been dealt with, that they'd effectively, for them, they felt that they compensated the community, and that the infection of the community, and indeed those who were infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusions, had largely been dealt with. The community obviously and rightly disagreed, and for many, many reasons, but I think for three principal ones. So I'm sure there are many other reasons that others would give, but these are the three principal reasons I think that we can advance as to why the community disagreed with the fact that the issue had been dealt with. Firstly, the financial settlements were inadequate. They were based on people, some of them at least, were based on people living for a short period only. Of course, sadly and tragically, many people did only live for a short period of time. But they left behind loved ones, they left behind families, and that money did nothing to compensate or indeed to support many of those people, in the sense that many people, again, one of the themes that's come out is that many people gave up their livelihoods and became carers for their other halves. And as I say, they effectively lost their careers as a result of this. And so these financial settlements, as it were completely inadequate. And of course, other people also went on to live for a very long time, having thought that they only had a handful of years to live. And as a result, again, those financial settlements were not felt to be adequate for them. Secondly, rightly, I think, again, the community wanted an investigation into what Lord Winston referred to as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Of course, those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it, and very much our community wanted to know what went wrong so we could ensure that it could never happen again, either to our community or indeed to anybody else. And finally, of course, people wanted answers. They wanted the truth. They wanted to know why the treatment that had been given to their loved ones had then gone on to kill them. Very few people go into hospital and come out of it worse off than when they went in, and the community wanted answers to those questions. So I think those are probably the three principal reasons, but as I say, I'm sure there are many other reasons that others would advance as to why the community kept pressing for a public inquiry. We have had inquiries before the infected blood inquiry, and significantly in the UK we've had two. The first one was announced in February 2007 by Lord Morris of Manchester, and he announced an independent inquiry into contaminated blood, which was headed up by Lord Archer. Not that Lord Archer, the other Lord Archer. And he headed up an inquiry into contaminated blood. It was an independent inquiry, but it wasn't a public inquiry. So what's the difference? Well, an independent inquiry doesn't have statutory powers. So it doesn't have the power to compel witnesses to give evidence. It doesn't have the ability to summons witnesses to give evidence or indeed to demand evidence and documents. So effectively, it could only look at what people were willing to give it. And so it was only therefore able to look at part of the whole picture. It wasn't able to carry out a full and thorough investigation. Although, as many people I think would agree, it was still a very worthwhile inquiry and came out with many interesting findings and recommendations. As a result of devolution in April 2008, Nicola Sturgeon, who I think, don't think she was the First Minister for Scotland, and I think she may well have been the Health Minister at the time, but she announced a public inquiry in Scotland, which was eventually headed up by Lord Penrose. The initial chair of the inquiry had to step down for personal reasons, and Lord Penrose took over the inquiry. Again, that was somewhat hamstrung in the same way that the Archer inquiry was hamstrung by not having statutory powers. It was hamstrung because, of course, much of what happened was a Westminster issue, if I can describe it that way, in the sense that the contaminated blood scandal happened on Westminster's watch before health was a devolved issue, which again meant that the Penrose inquiry could only look at a small part of the picture. Afterwards, some campaigners branded it a whitewash, and it only actually came out with one recommendation, believe it or not, Penrose, and that one recommendation was that there should be a look-back exercise into those people who'd been infected with hepatitis C as a result of blood transfusions. No other recommendations which were made, which I think many of the community found to be quite staggering. So say those were the issues and the shortcomings with the two inquiries we've had thus far. So how did we get to the infected blood inquiry, a full statutory inquiry in the United Kingdom? Well, there's no clear answer as to why we got there. The only person that will actually be able to tell you the answer, I think, is the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, who in July 2017 announced the infected blood inquiry. Why did she announce it? Well, as I say, only Theresa May will ever know why, and we can only speculate as to why we actually now have the inquiry. We know that it was announced at very short notice. We, as the Haemophilia Society, found out at lunchtime on the Tuesday when it was announced, and Theresa May had only told her cabinet that morning. And so, as I say, it wasn't something that we'd been privy to or even had any mutterings or soundings on in relation to the fact that it was going to be announced. So it was announced at short notice. So we could, as I say, we can only speculate as to why the infected blood inquiry was finally announced in the United Kingdom. And there are three reasons, and a fourth reason, which I'll give on the next slide. But the three principal reasons which we can put forward as to why we managed to secure an inquiry eventually in the UK was, as I say, as a result of the political climate at the time. Firstly, Andy Burnham, who was an MP at the time and now, of course, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, was about to step down from Parliament. In his last speech to Parliament, he decided to dedicate that speech to the contaminated blood inquiry. He said in his speech that he had evidence of a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. And if an inquiry wasn't announced, then he would take that evidence to the police for them to investigate it. Quite what that evidence is, we don't know, and I'm sure we'll find out in due course during the course of the inquiry. But as I say, Andy Burnham was making a lot of noises, very helpfully for our community, saying that he had evidence of a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale, and he was going to go to the police if an inquiry was not announced. Secondly, we know that all the opposition leaders at the time were signing a letter to be sent to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, to demand a public inquiry. And so again, the political pressure was ramping up. Thirdly, as many people will be aware, there's a group legal action taken by Jason Evans and many others with Factor 8 campaign and challenging the legality of that waiver to which we've mentioned back in 1989 to see whether or not that was legal or not. And of course, if the waiver was found not to be legal, then it could have potentially opened the door for further proceedings against government. The legal action at the moment has been put on hold, it's been put on ice, so it's not proceeding any further whilst the inquiry is still being undertaken. So that legal action, as I say, was taken out, and it was felt as a result of those three things really. Of course, there were many other things going on in the background with people continually campaigning over the years, but those again, I think, were the three principal reasons as to why we finally managed to secure an inquiry in the United Kingdom. There is a fourth reason, and this has been proffered to me and some others at the Haemophilia Society, but by several sources, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but I think it's only fair to give the whole picture, as it were. At the time, as we all know, the Conservative government were propped up by the DUP in Northern Ireland, and they were propped up by them in what was known as a confidence and supply arrangement. And it's understood, as I say, from several sources who've told me and others, that the DUP demanded, as part of that confidence and supply arrangement with the Conservative Party, that there must be an inquiry into contaminated blood. And if there wasn't, then they wouldn't sign that confidence and supply agreement. To say that's the fourth reason that's been proffered to me and others as to why we eventually reached that inquiry. When the inquiry was announced, there was an initial challenge, initial issue for us to deal with. I say us, the community at large, to deal with, namely the fact that the Department of Health were named as the sponsoring department for the inquiry. I think, as some people said, it's a little bit like asking students to mark their own homework. And the Department of Health, of course, are to be investigated. They are a core participant in the inquiry, and it was felt that it was completely inappropriate for the Department of Health to effectively be the sponsoring department and investigating themselves. The road to having it moved away from the Department of Health was not an easy one. There were meetings with a gentleman by the name of Bishop James, who some people would be familiar with. He was very heavily involved with the Hillsborough disaster and the Hillsborough inquiry, and he kindly offered his services. And there was a meeting in London at the British Medical Association up near on Tavistock Square. And as a result of that meeting, he wrote to the government on our behalf, demanding that it be moved to the Cabinet Office, or moved away at least from the Department of Health. And the government eventually acceded to that request and moved it to the Cabinet Office. Later that year, we were told in December that we would have the chair of the inquiry announced. We were told that it would be a judge, and of course the Lord Chief Justice of the day was being consulted. We were told that announcement was to be made in December. That date came and went without any announcement even being told about any delay. And eventually, at the end of the following January, we were told that the chair of the inquiry would be Sir Brian Langstaff, a recently retired well, in fact, he was still sitting at the time and was due to retire very shortly, I think in the April of 2018, and from being a High Court judge. And he had previous experience as counsel to the Bristol Heart Inquiry, so he's very well versed in public inquiries generally. The next phase for the inquiry was obviously to get a team together. Part of the issue, at least I think some people feel, is that the Grenfell inquiry had been announced some months before, and I dare say that many people who might have worked on the infected blood inquiry were probably gathered already for the Grenfell inquiry. And as a result, there was somewhat of a delay in terms of putting the team together, but eventually the team was put together, and the next phase was to undertake consultations, for Sir Brian Langstaff to undertake consultations and draw together the terms of reference. And the terms of reference are exactly that. They are the matters into which the inquiry will look. It doesn't just have a blank sheet of paper. There are a list of issues, and they are on the inquiry website if anybody cares to look at them. And as I say, they set out the terms of reference as to the matters into which the inquiry will look. The inquiry started back on the 24th of September 2018 now at a place called Church House near very close to Westminster. And it was started with 3 days of opening hearings where Sir Brian Langstaff and counsels to the inquiry, Jenny Richards QC, all made opening statements, and then all the core participants were enabled to make statements as well. On the first day, there was actually a memorial service which kicked off the whole event, which is the first time I think there's ever been any sort of public acknowledgement and memorial of those who've sadly died from this. And that was, I know, for many a very moving time, and meant a lot to people that finally there'd been some recognition of what had gone on. The principles at the time were set out by Sir Brian Langstaff in relation to the inquiry, and he put forward 6 principles. Firstly, that people would be at the heart of the inquiry. that it would be thorough, that it would have respect, that it would be open and transparent, it would be independent of government and scared of nobody, in particular government, and lastly, that it would listen. And finally, then, the oral evidence in relation to victim personal testimony from those who either from families of people who have died or those who've been infected commenced in April 2019. And that's where I shall now leave you and very happily pass you on to Jessica Bomford, who is the lady behind our Twitter feed and indeed our public inquiry posts on our Facebook page. So many people will be familiar with all of those posts, but as I say, for the first time, you may well get to actually see Jessica, the lady behind the post. So I'm glad to now hand over to her.
Hi, welcome to everybody. I hope it's not too much of a shock if you haven't seen me before. Great to see some familiar faces, and my role with the inquiry, with the public inquiry team at the Society, is to deal with communications, as Clive said. So that has given me the immense privilege of listening to almost all of the personal testimonies that have been presented to the inquiry. We've heard from 189 people so far.
Jessica, you're breaking up.
More than 3,000 have submitted written evidence, and a further 80. Oh,
yeah.
Okay,
you
sorry.
might have to stop your video, Jessica. Your voice is breaking up a little bit. Apologies.
Okay, sorry. There we go. Okay, well, that was a brief sight of me. That's probably quite enough anyway. So 89 people have chosen to give their evidence through a third party, an intermediary. And in February, the intermediaries came to the inquiry to present that evidence. We've also heard from 22 expert witnesses in HIV, hepatitis, psychology, and bleeding disorders.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Michelle.
Oh, hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be a part of this group. Thank you. I thought I did it wrong. Sorry, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Great to have you.
Oh, yeah, brilliant. Pleased to be here. Thank you.
So every story that the inquiry has heard is unique and important in its own right, but what has very quickly emerged is that there have been many overlaps in people's experiences, and it's those overlaps that I'm picking up on now and will use as my themes for this short presentation. Now, I know a number of you have followed the inquiry very closely, and you may feel that there are things that I've missed out. There are many themes that have cropped up, so please use the chat function to let me know, and we can have a little pause at the end of this section, and we can talk about the themes that you would like raised as well. It's probably also worth mentioning at this point that it isn't too late to submit written evidence. You can do that directly or through. One strand that is run through pretty much every testimony is a lack of consent for testing, that's HIV and hepatitis, and the long gaps between diagnosis and consultants telling patients of that diagnosis. And that long gap has led to people unwittingly infecting loved ones, and stress and uncertainty. We've also heard from many people about missing, incomplete, or inaccurate medical records. Many people have had great difficulty getting hold of their medical records. There have been more than one example of people who've been trying to get hold of these records for years, only to find that they arrived literally the day before they started to give evidence to the inquiry. We've also heard a number of allegations concerning secret research. In particular, it has been suggested that previously untreated patients, known as PUPs, so we're talking here potentially about people with mild or moderate haemophilia, with von Willebrand's, children, were particularly vulnerable to being considered useful research tools, for want of a better word. And there's been quite a lot of evidence on this subject. We also heard from a witness in Edinburgh who referred to the Edinburgh cohort, which is a group of people who believe that they were used as a part of an AIDS study. And sadly, there was evidence that was written on the note, at least one. Surprisingly, many participants in the inquiry have lost all faith in their medical professions. Bearing in mind that many had an almost family-like relationship with their Haemophilia Centre, and there was a huge amount of trust between haemophilia clinicians and staff and the families that use their services. And a lot of that trust has been broken, and that has had a knock-on effect even to today, when people understandably are uncertain about their treatment and whether to proceed with all the new treatment which is coming through for haemophilia. I did tell people, others about this, and that included close family. In some cases, we heard from people who were told not even to tell their parents. And so going into HIV with this feeling of isolation and fear and uncertainty about who else was in this position left many people unable to shrug off that secrecy as the years went by. And we've heard from many witnesses anonymously who do not feel able to be public about their involvement with the contaminated blood scandal. We have had a couple of witnesses who have used their testimony to come out, as one witness described it. It was the first time that he told anyone outside his immediate family, including his parents-in-law, that he had been infected as a result of the scandal. So as a result of that, and a result of ignorance around HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, many people hid having haemophilia completely because they understood that many people believed haemophilia and HIV were linked without understanding why that might be. We've also heard that some people felt let down and lacking in support. The Macfarlane Trust, which, as Clive mentioned, was set up in 1991 to provide support for people infected with HIV, has received a lot of criticism. And in the spirit of fairness, the Haemophilia Society has also been criticised by some for not being around, in those people's opinions, for people in particular who are infected with HIV. And as I'll say later on in a little bit more detail, the Haemophilia Society will be asked to give evidence in February, so that and other aspects of the Society's involvement in the scandal will be explored in more detail at that stage. The psychological impact on those infected and affected has been explored in great detail by the inquiry. It's a question that every single witness is asked. Very few were offered psychological support at the point of diagnosis. And that lack of support has continued over the subsequent decades. We've heard of a huge amount of guilt. We've heard from mothers who have never got over the fact that they administered the contaminated factor VIII to their sons, from siblings who've been infected at the same time as their brother. They have survived, their brother has died. We've heard of groups of school friends, particularly, I'm talking about Trelaw's School, which again is subject to its own special investigation. But Trelaw's School had its own haemophilia centre, and we've heard very, very harrowing testimony of the dwindling numbers who remain and the responsibility that has fallen on their shoulders to follow through and to find answers and try to get justice for all the people that have died. We've also had a lot of evidence about the wide-ranging mental health impact on families. And it's not just the immediate family, but for children and grandchildren. We've heard how 3 generations and more of families are affected by this. This is an ongoing thing for families. This has not been resolved. People have not moved on from this. And subsequently, the burden of psychological impact does not lessen, it gets worse. And we've heard that over and over again from people who are grappling again to deal with the trauma of their memories as they've been re-traumatized. They've had to revisit those memories and they're finding it difficult to get the support they need. In particular, we've heard a lot of evidence about the physical and mental damage caused by interferon treatment for hepatitis C. There have been many discussions about side effects, particularly the brain fog and the ongoing impact of side effects, which many were told would be temporary, but feel that they have lasted decades along with them. And many people giving evidence feel that they were changed permanently by their experience of a very harsh interferon treatment. What emerged from evidence from people who'd been infected as a result of blood transfusions was the lack of awareness among medical professionals in diagnosing hepatitis C. Many witnesses went to their GP with classic symptoms of hepatitis C and were simply dismissed. Fatigue and transfusions during childbirth were dismissed because they were it was felt well they would be tired because they've got children. We heard from many witnesses about the extreme fear they had of passing infection to others, and that sometimes was reinforced by the behaviour of their friends and their family. We heard some very difficult evidence. One person described going to stay with a friend and discovering afterwards that the friend had burned the bed sheets that she'd slept on. Somebody else discovered that all the glasses and crockery that she'd used when she'd gone to a friend's house had been thrown away. And we heard very moving stories about people who did not want to hug their grandchildren, who were worried that they were going to infect the people that they loved the most, and that had a very profound impact on their relationship. And there's also been a lot of discussion about the lack of ongoing hepatitis C monitoring and how that has fueled people's concern and stress about developing liver cancer and other complications, and the feeling that this could be happening without it being detected. The lack of financial support, as Clive has already alluded to a certain extent, began in the very early days of infection and has continued all the way through to the present day. And we've heard a lot of evidence about the current system, the infected blood support schemes. There's one in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. They all offer slightly different, in some cases vastly different support. And we've heard evidence about people feeling they have to constantly jump through bureaucratic hoops to get the most basic financial support, that they have to get a huge amount of evidence simply to get something such as a new mattress. And many have given up because the stress of getting whatever equipment they need far outweighs the benefit of having it. And once again, the mental health impact of the lack of financial support has been mentioned many times, including the triggering that many people feel when they get that brown envelope from the Department of Work and Pensions. Will it be another reassessment? Will I have to prove yet again what I've been through and tell somebody else who doesn't understand anything about this what I've gone through? So that's a brief run through. I said earlier, look ahead to what the inquiry is going to do now. We have 18 weeks of public hearings ahead of us beginning in September, and we'll start with the Haemophilia Centre clinicians and staff, and priority will be given in terms of people who can be present at the hearing to those that have a direct connection with the centre in question. As I mentioned, the Haemophilia Society, their role in the contaminated blood scandal will be discussed for 2 weeks in February, followed by Trusts and Schemes, McFarlane Trust, the Skipton Fund, etc. And then Trelaw School, the boarding school with the Haemophilia Centre attached, which I mentioned earlier, will have a week devoted to what happened there in March, and we await to hear the rest. So please do let us know through chat if there's anything that you'd like to discuss at this point. And if not, I shall move on to Anne Harrod.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Anne Harrod, Anne Harrod is from Evershed, Sutherland, and has been involved in many inquiries. So, Jessica, if you unshare your screen, we should then be able to see Anne Harrod.
I haven't got a presentation or anything, Deborah, so it's just me, unfortunately, everybody.
Fine, that'd be lovely. Over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. As Deborah said, my name's Anne Harrod and I am a Principal Associate at Evershed, Sutherland, and my background is in public inquiries. So the team that I'm part of has run a number of public inquiries, and we also act on behalf of the core participants in other inquiries as well. So in the past, I was the solicitor to the independent Jersey Care inquiry. So that was the inquiry into child abuse on the island of Jersey. And in addition to representing the Haemophilia Society in the IBI inquiry, I also represent some core participants in the Grenfell Tower inquiry and also the UK child abuse inquiry. So as Jessica has said, and as Clive introduced as well, this inquiry has been a long time coming, and we have now started to hear the evidence, and the inquiry to date has heard significant evidence from those infected and affected. And the next phase of the evidence, which will start in the hearings in September, will be shifting somewhat the focus from the infected and affected onto the clinicians, the society, Trelaws and the schemes. So during the period of lockdown, whilst there haven't been any hearings, the inquiry has certainly been working in the background, and I suspect it has really been utilising that time to make as much progress as possible with the millions of documents that it will have to process. And whilst on the one hand it can be frustrating that nobody is actually seeing that work as such, I think that will really have a benefit, and an impact will be seen when those hearings resume in September. So as just an idea of the volume of documents, to date as a core participant, the Society has received, I'll just check my notes, 18,811 documents. And that equates to over 113,000 pages. And we know there is still a lot more to come over the next week. We actually received an email this morning to say that they're expecting to disclose a further 2,000 documents next week, for example. So by the inquiry taking its time now to actually review those documents, it's informing itself of the key areas of investigation for the next 6 months at least. When the inquiry announced this proposed timetable week before last, I have to admit I was quite surprised that they'd given such long forecasts of the timescales. Usually inquiries, because they often are working hand to mouth, that they're reviewing the documents as they're coming in, trying to set the timetable, because they often don't have the luxury of time, they then have, they'll publish a timetable for, say, the next 3 months, and then there's a waiting game to say when the next lot will start. So over this period of lockdown, as a result of it looking through all these documents, we suspect that they will now be able to really focus their attentions on the key areas as they have now identified in those documents. And going forward, I suspect we will really see a shift in the types of questions and the approach that counsel to inquiry and the chair will take to the witnesses going forward. So as Clive stated during his initial section, this inquiry is slightly different because it's a statutory inquiry, and that means that it has got the powers to subpoena evidence, and it's not only documentation, that is also individuals. So if, for example, the inquiry contacts a clinician and says, we really want you to come and provide evidence, and they say, well, actually, I don't want to, the chair has got the power to subpoena that individual to attend to provide evidence. If that individual chooses, it still continues to say, actually, I can't, the only grounds on which the chair would accept that would be for medical grounds. And if that is the case, the individual who is refusing to provide evidence would need to provide medical evidence to the chair in support of that. And it would have to be, the chair would have to satisfy himself that that individual is incapable of providing evidence. In some of the processes that have actually, and procedures that have been changed recently with the inquiry, the chair has actually reserved his position to be able to actually obtain their own medical evidence. So they won't necessarily just take an individual's GP saying, this individual is too unwell to come to provide evidence. The chair can actually request that that individual attends a medical examination at the choice and discretion of the chair. So to date, for those of you who have followed the evidence, it has very much been focused on the individual telling their story and ensuring that they are being listened to. And for many, it's the first time in decades that they have had that opportunity to be listened to. And often counsel to the inquiry will say, you've provided a statement, please tell us your story, in effect. And they have honed in on those key themes as mentioned by Jessica. However, going forward, I suspect that counsel to the inquiry will now be far more forceful in the questions that she puts to the witnesses. I also anticipate that they will have far more documentation being put to them. And if an individual were to say, I can't remember that happening, I would not be surprised if the chair actually starts stepping in a bit more and saying, right, well, do you need the opportunity to review some of these documents? And have a break, have a look at those documents, and then come back and think about your answer. In addition, a number of those key witnesses will be provided with bundles of documentation in advance them providing evidence to try and avoid that situation from arising. So they will be given a bundle in advance, say these are the key areas that we want you to focus on. And I think we are in to see quite a shift in the focus. Jumping back slightly to those powers of subpoena, if the individual is subpoenaed, so under Section 21 of the Inquiries Act, the chair has the ability to issue a Section 21 notice and to say, we want you to come and provide evidence on X date. If that individual does not turn up, it is the equivalent of contempt of court, and ultimately that individual could be arrested. They try not to take it that far, and if I'm perfectly honest, however, a number of the chairs will use the powers available to them to at least issue that Section 21 notice. And if anybody ever came to me having received a Section 21 notice, I most certainly wouldn't advise them to ignore it, and would advise them quite strongly to cooperate as much as possible. Equally, if somebody does turn up, they listen to that, they comply with the Section 21 notice, they turn up and then simply says, I can't remember, or, doesn't want to comment, that is obviously, they're within their rights to do that. But in these kinds of circumstances, because it is a public inquiry and everything is played out publicly, again, that would not go down very well, and the court of public opinion would most certainly have quite a lot to say about that as well. So I think going forward, the things will be far more probative, and I think we will see where the inquiry really has its bite and whether the chair is willing to use those powers. And from what we've seen to date, with some of the preliminary issues that the chair has already had to deal with, I suspect that he won't be afraid to use those powers that are available to him.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne Harrod. That's really useful. Again, if there's anybody's got any questions, please do type them in the chat box and we can come back to those at the end. I think I'm now going to hand over to Clive again, who's going to go through some of the hopes and aspirations from the inquiry. Clive, I'll hand over to you.
I touched on this 2 weeks ago when I said that when the inquiry was announced, one of the first things that the Haemophilia Society did was that we, several of us travelled to Dublin to go and see Brian O'Mahony from the Irish Haemophilia Society to discuss his experience then. And one of the things he said at the outset, he said it's always important to write down at the start what it is you want, because he said as you go through, he said things will change rapidly, and he said and it's always very good to have this as a document, as a reference point, as a touch point, as it were, to come back to. And so that's what we did. And we've got here to start with some bullet points of what it is we want, and I'll put some flesh on the bones in a few moments. Like everybody, we want truth and justice. Secondly, of course, we want proper compensation for our community. Thirdly, we want to see adequate and appropriate and comprehensive psychological support. Fourthly, we want to see continuing care for those who have been affected. And then finally, we want to see future care for people with a bleeding disorder and ensure that that's the best it can be in the United Kingdom. So turning to each of those, in relation to truth and justice, in terms of what that looks like for us as the Haemophilia Society, we require full exposure of who knew what and when, and a clear understanding of what motivated the decisions to be made. And that really goes back to Sir Brian's point in relation to the 6 principles in relation to thoroughness. We want a full and thorough inquiry into what happened. Secondly, we said that we want those shown to be responsible must be held to account. And in terms of how they should be held to account, well, if appropriate, then that should be done through further legal action. It's very much the Haemophilia Society's position at this stage that we're certainly not demanding legal action against anybody at this stage, because we feel that might be a little bit to put the cart before the horse. But once there has been a full and thorough investigation by Sir Brian Langstaff, Sir Brian has already said himself that if he finds evidence of criminal conduct, then he will refer that to the Crown Prosecution Service, and it will be a matter for the Director of Public Prosecutions to take up. So to say, we very much support that inquiry and that staged approach, as it were. And if there is evidence of any criminal activity, then we would certainly call for legal action against those individuals. Next, we require an acknowledgement of the pain and hurt caused by this scandal. One point that I didn't raise earlier, but in relation to Andy Burnham's speech when he was making his final speech in Parliament, was that he said that he felt that government had preyed on the community. And he said, what he meant by that was the fact that so many of the community have experienced stigma, fear and isolation. And as a result, they've not been willing and able to stand up in public and say, I've been infected and I want a public inquiry, because they feared the consequences of so doing, in a way that perhaps people in other inquiries in the United Kingdom have been able to stand up and say, my son died or my relative died as a result of this and I want a public inquiry. Andy Burnham felt very much that we as a community have been preyed upon in terms of our silence. And so that we require, as I say, an acknowledgement of the pain and hurt caused by this scandal. Next, of course, we ask for a thorough and credible investigation which gives the community confidence that the truth has been uncovered. We've touched upon already what's happened in the United Kingdom thus far in relation to the Archer inquiry and the Penrose inquiry. This really is, as I think everybody appreciates, this is the last chance saloon. I don't think there will be any further inquiries or investigations into this. And so the current inquiry must be thorough and credible. And thus far, we have every reason to feel that it will deliver on that. Next, as many other people have called for as well, and we certainly support and welcome this, we call for a government-funded national memorial to be established as a permanent tribute to those who died. I mentioned already the memorial service back in September 2018, and the fact that that was the first real public acknowledgement of what had befallen our community. As I say, that needs to be added to by a national memorial to those who have died. Next, we ask that there be a meaningful government apology. We know already that there's been an apology from David Cameron when he was the Prime Minister after the Penrose inquiry reported. But at the time, we hadn't had the full thorough investigation. So, of course, it's very easy, isn't it, to apologise when you don't know what it is you're apologising for. Once the inquiry has come to a conclusion and we know exactly what went wrong and why, we then ask that there is a full and meaningful government apology about what went wrong. Next, we ask that the infected and affected be properly financially compensated for the effect that receiving infected blood has had on their lives, including the lost opportunities. I mentioned this in my introduction in relation to those people who've given up many of their lives and careers to be carers for their loved ones, and of course those who've died or have had been infected with these life-limiting conditions and have lost those opportunities to have children, to have families, and to have careers, and they must be properly compensated for that. That compensation should be based on the financial, psychological, physical and social impact the infections have caused. And so I perhaps don't need to say any more than that, because that's been abundantly clear, the impact of all of that from the themes that Jessica set out already. Like other groups, we support the call that work should begin now before the end of the inquiry through the Cabinet Office in consultation with the affected community to establish a framework for awarding compensation. We know that the inquiry isn't likely to report for another 2 years, and what we don't want to happen is, of course, for the inquiry to report, for compensation to be recommended, and then of course for us to have to wait several years for a process to be gone through for that money then to become available. Well, exactly, we will. Many people will be dead by then. But as I say, no, not at all. That's very much the point, Michelle. You're right. The fact that anyone who is likely to sadly die before the end of this should know that when they go to their graves, that they know that there should be some sort of financial security for their family, because too many people have died already without that, without knowing that. And as a result, as we say, there should be no delay, therefore, if this framework is established now, in being able to distribute that compensation at the end of the inquiry. Lastly, then, we say that until compensation is paid, that there must be fair and equitable and equal funding through the United Kingdom's for infected blood support schemes, and the eligibility for those schemes should be widened to include the bereaved parents and children. Many people will know about the constant struggle that now that health is a devolved issue across the United Kingdom, that this is a constant struggle in terms of trying to get the 4 nations to actually sit down and have some sort of conversation about what it is that will eventually be, about reaching parity in relation to the schemes. As well, we suggest that those infected and affected should be entitled to free, accessible, long-term specialist psychological support for as long as they need it. Back in February, when we had the experts giving evidence, I was struck by one of the psychologists who one of the experts, when she was giving evidence, who said that she said in all the evidence and testimony that she's seen and that she's read, she didn't feel there was a single person who wouldn't still benefit from psychological support even at this late remove. I thought that was a compelling piece of evidence. So, as I say, that specialist long-term support is desperately required for our community. Funds must be made available to support those infected with HIV. We heard again back in February when experts gave their evidence that, of course, happily for many now, HIV is a very treatable condition. We know that U equals U. If you have an undetectable viral load, you're unable to transmit it. If it's undetectable, it's untransmittable. And so happily, HIV is a very treatable condition these days. However, people who were infected back in the 80s, of course, have lived with this condition for many, many years now. And I think what was apparent from the experts giving evidence is that living with HIV for 30 or 40 years is very different to being infected in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe. So, as we say, this is a unique community which requires that specialist medical support and understanding in a way that those who have sadly been infected more recently perhaps don't require. There must be a clear set of national guidelines established on best practice for monitoring chronic hepatitis C patients, including regular scans and follow-up appointments. I think Jessica would agree on this, that one of the themes that has come out of this is the disparate approach in terms of follow-up to those who have been infected with hepatitis C. What happens in one area of the country might not happen in another. So there needs to be a clear set of national guidelines in relation to the monitoring of those people. There must, of course, be access to insurances, including life cover at fair and equitable rates. Many people have not been able to work, have not been able to get insurance, and say have been left in a perilous financial position, not as a result of anything that they've done wrong, but as a result of infection through these blood products and through treatment. And as a result of that, as I say, they shouldn't be punished further by not being able to access insurance and life cover and those sorts of financial packages. There must be access to the best currently available treatments for bleeding disorders for all, regardless of cost. I don't think that's a huge issue in the United Kingdom, but there are certainly some issues in relation to, there's a further bullet point in relation to recombinant products being available. The second point on this slide here mentions national guidelines being set out for mandatory best practice standards of care to ensure that everyone with a bleeding disorder receives the same high quality treatment regardless of which haemophilia centre they attend. This is the third in our series of our Bleeding Matters Live webinars. Of course, the first one was in relation to the quality report, the quality review scheme, which has been undertaken across the United Kingdom over the last couple of years in relation to all 37 centres. And you only need to read the overview report to again see that best practice is not in existence in all parts of the country. In particular, things like physio care and psychological support as well is non-existent. Certainly at a centre like Manchester, for example, with 1,200 patients with bleeding disorders, they currently have no psychiatric or psychological support whatsoever. So those national guidelines must set out this best practice, and those centres must be funded adequately so that they can provide that support as well. There must be universal access to a comprehensive care package, as I just touched upon, including physiotherapy, occupational therapy, social support and counselling. Recombinant or non-plasma derived treatment must be available for all bleeding disorders where it exists. The United Kingdom is a recombinant for all country, as it were. That is government policy, that is the NHS policy, and yet still only recently, in recent months, we've had von Willebrand's factor, non-plasma derived recombinant factor, turned down by NHS England. So that's a battle we continue to fight. Because all of this, as I say, we talk about future care. We can't make any difference to that. We can make a difference to those people who are still alive, but to those who are dead, we can't change things. But what we can do is we can change things for their children, their grandchildren, and their future generations. So part of the apology we feel to the community is, say, it can't be made now for those so many who have died, but it can be made to the community at large by way of having the best possible care for those who are now dealing with bleeding disorders. So as we say, part of that relates to government championing future provision of new technologies and therapies for people with bleeding disorders. So as we know, there are many new treatments coming online for the bleeding disorders community, and it's important that government champion those for our community, we feel, as part of the apology which is overdue to our community. And then access to appropriate social care with a comprehensive understanding of needs for the ageing population to offer dignity and safety in old age. Again, we know with our ageing population, it can be very much a challenge for many of them to get into nursing homes, for example, where they still require intravenous treatment. There are many nursing homes, for example, that won't take people because they're not able to administer their medication. So there must be access to that appropriate social care so people are able to access nursing homes or whatever care is relevant to them in their ageing lives. So the last thing it leaves for me to say is thank you to all those who've also spoken this evening. Thank you to Jessica, thank you to Anne Harrod, and thank you to Deborah for chairing things. As I say, this is the third in our series, and our next one will be in only a week's time, actually, and our next one will be on the 30th of July, when we'll be discussing emicizumab and personal experiences. We'll be having several patients talking about their own experiences. So say that brings us just a little bit past 7 o'clock. So we're not rushing off anywhere, as Deborah's already mentioned. There will be time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please do pop them in the chat box. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Clive, and thank you to Deborah for inviting me to come along. It's been amazing. I've learned so much, and I would like to continue to follow this. I know the Hepatitis C Trust are following this, and I know they have mentioned you in their new newsletter that's going out. So well done, guys. You know, all the best to you. It's a minefield for all of us. I'm so happy to be here tonight.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. So I've just got a couple of questions that have come up, and Howard, I think this is probably one to ask you. Yeah. And somebody said, is there a deadline of sorts for personal statements?
The inquiry hasn't provided a deadline as yet. So the answer to that is no. However, I'd suspect when they finish this next phase of hearings, they will then be starting to think, well, we've got to conclude the evidence at some stage. So I anticipate that they will impose a deadline at some stage, but we have not had that as yet. And I completely understand that this is a very difficult thing for people to actually put their experiences on paper, and it isn't only when they meet with us and relay their story to us, it's actually then having to sit down and read it again to make sure they're happy with it and to finalize that statement. So it is a very difficult process for anybody to go through. Therefore, I would hope that the inquiry would give us sufficient warning if they are going to impose a deadline.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, and I will answer the first bit myself and then pass it round. It says, do you have any recommendations for members who may be finding it hard to confront the past in this way? And as you just said, unharried people have. I mean, I would say, first of all, there are some routes to getting some support. So if you're a member of any of the effective blood support schemes and the IBIS, you can apply for money to get a counsellor through there, whether you're infected or affected, the families. And there's obviously the Red Cross scheme, which is still open from the inquiry, and they are still there to talk to. And also, if you've been affected by HIV, you can also apply through the Terence Higgins Trust. And I know a lot of people have gained great support by the community as a whole. The hearings will start again. I think it will look and feel very different, but I think people have found quite a lot of support just from talking to other members as well. So anybody else want to add to that point?
From a practical perspective, if you have provided a witness statement to a solicitor or met with them and they've drafted a statement and sent that back to you, and it's just too difficult to go through that, there may be ways, and we've done it in the past with inquiries, is to actually submit that as best evidence as opposed to a signed statement of truth. But that would be something we'd have to explore with the inquiry as to whether they'd be willing to accept that as evidence without having it in the formal witness statement form.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Clive, I might put this to you. What efforts are being made to harmonise viewpoints between the different campaign groups, including the society? That's quite a tricky one.
It is. There's a long answer and a short answer. I'll try and give somewhat of a medium answer. I think when the inquiry was initially announced, there were 2 meetings in Birmingham, actually, by the majority of the campaign groups to try and harmonise viewpoints. Sadly, that didn't succeed in terms of trying to get everybody together. And then since then, there have been 2 meetings with government. There was one in January of this year and one in January of the year before. January of 2019, the meeting there were several meetings by about 10 or 15 different groups, because that meeting was specifically about trying to level up the payment schemes across the 4 devolved nations. And there were several meetings there where we talked and came up with a set of principles about what happened, about what it was we wanted in terms of the payments. I think touching briefly, I think one of the sad side effects of all of this, the fact that it's taken so long to get the inquiries, it's given lots of people time to fall out with each other. And so there are lots of disparate groups. But I think one of the good things about the inquiry is actually being there day in, day out, week in, week out with others, is it's given groups an opportunity to speak. Sometimes just over a cup of coffee or sometimes a drink afterwards, those sorts of things. So I think the groups are still trying to work together as far as possible. There are obviously some people who have very different group opinions to others. But as I say, I think it might be one of those that that hopefully we get to a stage by the end of the inquiry where we all evolve together and get to a stage where we have many shared views. I know even recently I've been having conversations with people behind the scenes. I'm very much in touch with Haemophilia Scotland, Haemophilia Northern Ireland, and occasionally with Wales too, and we have discussions about what it is we want. So we do stay in touch behind the scenes as such. So that's probably about as much as I can say. So we are working on that. We know it's obviously better to be united wherever possible, and we continue to work on that. But it's an ongoing project.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I'm not quite sure if we can answer this one at the moment, and how it might be an idea perhaps to reflect on other inquiries. Will compensation be a standard sum or reviewed on a case-by-case basis? I think this person said that they wouldn't really want to have to go through the history, the effects on Hep C on them, and the treatment associated if they can be avoided. Or even Clive, if you've got opinions on this.
Do you want to go first, Clive, or shall I?
I don't mind. I could start. In terms of compensation, the important thing to say, and I'm sure the point Anne Howard was going to make at the outset, is that the inquiry cannot order compensation to be paid. All it can do is make a recommendation to government that compensation should be paid. There are two phases in all of this. Firstly, we obviously need to have a good inquiry, and secondly, we need to have a good response from government. I think a good response from government, I think everybody would agree, would be government paying compensation. In relation to that compensation, that's really what I was touching upon earlier when I talked about the ground plans being put together for any sort of compensation scheme, if, and I say if, because I say we don't know that it will happen. We of course hope that the inquiry will be the vehicle for that to happen. But if it happens, then of course, when it happens, then it's able to happen quickly. I think to the person asking the question, I think if you can use perhaps Ireland as a comparator. When Brian spoke a couple of weeks ago, I think Brian would be able to tell you more, but they have compensation tribunals, I believe, in Ireland, and each person is considered on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the impact of infection has been on everybody. So I appreciate, I think that the person asking the question says that they wouldn't necessarily like to go through all their history, but I think it may, if and when we get to that stage, it may be a necessary process to get to the answer.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and as Clive said, it is the inquiry cannot. All it can do is recommend that compensation is paid. With some other compensation schemes that have arisen as a result of an inquiry recommendation, sometimes they are based on a tariff. But again, that would be very difficult in these circumstances. So I think more often than not, they would have to have some element of a case-by-case basis as opposed to tariff. But again, that would be something that there would, I'd hope, be a public consultation on as well before anything like that would be set up. And it may be that there's a bit of a hybrid of both. So there's a tariff for those who don't want to have to go into detail, or, you know, a case-by-case basis would be another option.
Yeah, because I think that happened in Ireland as part of it. If for example, you, depending on your level of infection with hepatitis C, you could either take the money at the outset, in terms of if you were then to go on and develop stage 2 hepatitis, you could take the money then, or you could wait to see if you developed it and then go back to the compensation tribunal. So, because I think for many people, I'm sure you'll have seen this yourself, Anne Howard, that many people, when this process gets towards the end, they want some sort of finality to it all, and they want to be able to just say, right, I've got everything I'm going to get, I'm going to walk away and I'm going to get on with my life, and I don't want to have to keep coming back even if things get worse for me.
Yeah, Clive, I might just comment briefly. There are lots of pros and cons to any approach you take here with compensation. Obviously, both UK and Ireland paid lump sum compensation in 1991 to people with HIV. The benefit of that is it's relatively quick once the scheme is set up. On the other hand, you're not taking any account of individual circumstances, situations, or the impact it's had on people. Now, our hepatitis C compensation, and later our second HIV compensation, was on a case-by-case basis. The advantage of that is that it does look in detail at each case. It looks at every sort of impact it's had on the individual, but it does take longer. It's not a fast process. It's a process that will take a couple of years rather than perhaps a couple of months. But I would say that in terms of the question there, that nobody has had to go through their entire medical history and the impact on them in some sort of open public setting. It's all been very dignified and a private hearing with full support for the people. So I think any scheme you'd set up obviously would have that involved as part of it.
Thanks, Brian. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, well that's the end of the questions for now. So it just leaves me to thank everybody, all our speakers tonight, and for everybody else returning and listening to us. And as Clive said, we have another Bleeding Matters live next week on emicizumab, and the week after that there will be Will Horsley and John Hanley from the Clinical Reference Group, who have kindly come along and will present on their work and their role in anything from commissioning and to service provision. We will be planning many more of these Bleeding Matters live, so keep an eye on the website on our events calendar, and because there will be new ones advertised soon. So thank you to everybody, and have a nice evening. Good night.